Chapter 3. Strategy and Tactics at Work. Tactics is knowing what to do when there is something to do. Strategy is knowing what to do when there is nothing to do. Savili Tartakower. In the previous chapter, we discussed strategy as a clash of pieces on the board. In this one, we'll take a further step by including some psychological aspects of competition. Not just how your pieces can best your opponent's pieces, but how your mind can best your opponent's mind. In chess, we have the obligation to move. There is no option to skip a turn if you can't identify a direction that suits you. One of the great challenges of the game is how to make progress when there are no obvious moves, when action is required, not reaction. The great Polish chess master and wit, Tartakower, half-joking, called this the nothing-to-do phase of the game. In reality, it is here that we find what separates pretenders from contenders. This obligation to move can be a burden to a player without strategic vision. Unable to form a plan when there isn't an immediate crisis, he is likely to try to precipitate a crisis himself, and usually ends up damaging his own position. We learn from Pietrosian that vigilant inaction is a viable strategy in chess, but the art of useful waiting takes consummate skill. What exactly do you do when there is nothing to do? We call these phases positional play because our goal is to improve our position. You must avoid creating weaknesses, find small ways to improve your pieces, and think small, but never stop thinking. One tends to get lazy in quiet positions, which is why positional masters such as Karpov and Pietrosian were so deadly. They were always alert and were happy to go long stretches without any real action on the board, if it meant gaining a tiny advantage, and then another. Eventually, their opponents would find themselves without any good moves at all, as if they were standing on quicksand. In life, there is no such obligation to move. If you can't find a useful plan, you can watch television, stick with business as usual, and believe that no news is good news. Human beings are brilliantly creative at finding ways to pass time in unconstructive ways. At these times, a true strategist shines by finding the means to make progress, to strengthen his position, and prepare for the inevitable conflict. And conflict, we cannot forget, is inevitable. Europe was largely at peace entering the 20th century, and pacifist movements were making political inroads in European parliaments. Germany, meanwhile, was preparing for war, and its naval buildup was matched, even provoked in some cases, by Britain's. The responsibility for this lay with one man, Admiral John "Jackie" Fisher. Britain had quite literally ruled the waves for over a century, and in 1900 the British politicians and military leaders took this superiority entirely for granted. But Admiral Fisher insisted on modernizing the Royal Navy, building the first giant dreadnoughts, and encouraging the development of submarines, which others in the Admiralty saw as sneaky, and worst of all, un-English. Fisher, whose bellicose personality was ill-suited to affairs of state, had to push relentlessly to achieve his program of peacetime modernization. In 1910, he retired, exhausted not by sea battles, but by political battles. He was recalled by Winston Churchill at the outbreak of World War I in 1914, and although their disagreement over the Dardanelles campaign caused Fisher to resign less than a year later, his insistence on reforming the Royal Navy and making it a modern fighting force soon proved its worth. Jackie Fisher is now recognized by historians as one of Britain's greatest admirals, and he made many of his most important contributions without firing a shot. Here was a strategist who knew that not having anything to do didn't mean doing nothing. Element of surprise. As Fisher's example shows, there's always an advantage in being better prepared than your opponent. But at times, your opponent will come to the game thoroughly schooled in your style and ready to counter your favorite tactics. In this case, there's another advantage you can seize. You can undo all his careful work by changing the game. In my 1995 World Championship match against Indian star Viswanathan Vishy Anand in New York City, Halfway through the match, with the score tied at 1 win apiece, I abandoned my favorite lines for the fearsomely named Sicilian Dragon, a defense I had never played before in a serious game. It wasn't change for the sake of it. Other factors contributed to my selection of the Dragon. It leads to an uncompromising game, one in which white must choose the most aggressive continuation to have any chance of gaining the advantage. Anand was faced with the surprise of seeing it and the knowledge that I would have prepared it extensively. In addition, our research showed that Anand had little previous experience with the Dragon and felt less comfortable against it than against other sharp opening lines. If he went for the risky main variations, he could be sure I'd have something nasty waiting for him. Instead, unable to adjust, he played tamely and lost twice. Napoleon Bonaparte was famous for maintaining the element of surprise on the battlefield, particularly by pressing on with an attack that had apparently stalled. But he was not above using his own reputation for aggression to entrap his enemies. Napoleon prepared for the 1805 Battle of Austerlitz by retreating his forces from an excellent outpost, intentionally allowing the Russian Tsar's forces to move in and see the thin French lines in retreat. Young Tsar Alexander decided that this was his chance for glory and prepared an all-out attack, exactly what Napoleon wanted. He had quietly brought up reinforcements to the area he had made the Russians believe to be weak. This wasn't only a case of a clever trick working to perfection. First, Napoleon realized that he was outnumbered and that direct methods wouldn't suffice. He knew his opponent was young and impulsive and eager for glory. He also knew that no one would believe the great Napoleon would retreat from a commanding position voluntarily. Napoleon's strategy ingeniously combined all of these factors. The one-eyed Russian general Mikhail Kutuzov was the lone voice of caution, but his warnings to the Tsar went unheeded. Napoleon's gambit succeeded brilliantly. The Tsar's forces were routed in a single day. A genius for development. I often refer to the need for effective development, something that is now taken for granted by any chess player beyond the rank of novice. But it took the first great American sports hero to demonstrate the importance of this fundamental concept to the world. His lesson, that you should have a solid and well-developed position before going on the attack, is applicable to every field of battle. It seems preposterous to suggest that a single player could have a serious impact on such an ancient game in as short a time as a year, and yet, in 1858, America's Paul Morphy created a legacy that altered the chess landscape forever. The wealthy young man from New Orleans entered the chess world only because he was not yet of age to practice as a lawyer when he finished his studies. He quickly proved himself in a class above the best players in the United States, but the real competition was across the Atlantic. Reversing the path of the conquistadors, the 21-year-old demolished the greatest players of the day, one after the other. Morphy returned to the States as a hero. Little wonder, as he was the first American to achieve such global preeminence. While the official title of world champion wouldn't be recognized for another 30 years, there is no question that Paul Morphy was the king of chess. How did he do it? How could such a young man with no adequate competition in his native land so easily humiliate the best players in the world? Morphy's secret, and it's unlikely he was aware of it himself, was his understanding of positional play. Instead of flying directly into an attack, as was the rule in those days, Morphy first made sure everything was ready. He understood that a winning attack should only be launched from a strong position, and that a position with no weaknesses could not be overwhelmed. Unfortunately, he left no map behind, few writings that could explain his method. Morphy was so far ahead of his time that it took another quarter-century for these principles of development and attack to be rediscovered and formulated. This rediscovery was the achievement of Wilhelm Steinitz. By 1870, Steinitz had begun to develop his theories of defense, weaknesses, and strategic play. This is what divides the chess timeline into pre-Steinitz and post-Steinitz periods. Although Steinitz's immortality would have been assured by his theoretical contributions, he was also successful in implementing them on the board. In 1886, he battled Johannes Zukertort, a romantic attacker of the old school, in what is now remembered as the first official World Championship match. Despite losing 4 of the first 5 games, Steinitz and his principals triumphed in the end. He took the measure of his opponent, adjusted, and scored 9 wins to just 1 further loss. Zukertort simply could not comprehend how Steinitz could win without brilliant attacks. The evolution of the game has continued, but it was Steinitz, inspired by Morphy, who first brought the game out of the sea onto dry land. Sticking with a plan. During my 30 years as a professional chess player, we went from spending days researching an opponent by digging through musty books and journals to being able to pull up every single game in his career in seconds on a PC. It used to take months for tournament games to be published in specialist magazines. Now anyone can watch the games on the internet in real time. But the implications of the information revolution go much deeper than matters of convenience. With data becoming available instantaneously, our ability to deal with it must also move at warp speed. When a game is played in Moscow, it is instantly available for the entire world to analyze. An idea that took weeks to develop can be imitated by others the next day. So every player must be aware of both distant history and the immediate present and prepare accordingly. So it is harder than ever to employ surprise as a strategy on the chessboard. In 1987, I played a 6-game match of rapid chess on the stage of the London Hippodrome against England's Nigel Short, who would challenge me for the World Championship 6 years later. It was the first serious match of its kind, with a greatly accelerated rate of play. In these rapid games, we had just 25 minutes each to make all our moves, a far cry from traditional chess, where games can last up to 7 hours. I trained extensively with this new time limit and discovered that it was still possible to play deep concepts, despite the impossibility of calculating deeply on each move. Instead of a profound study of a position, we had to rely more on instinct. It would be fair to assume that in rapid chess, careful planning and strategic goals are secondary or even ignored in favor of quick calculation and intuition. And I would even say that for many players, this is exactly the case. If you don't like planning during a 7-hour game, you'll likely abandon it entirely in a rapid game. But the most successful players, at any speed, base their calculations firmly in strategic planning. Far from being mutually exclusive, the most effective analysis, and the fastest, is possible when there is a guiding strategy. My battle with Short for the World Championship in 1993 is a good example of sticking with a successful strategy. In my preparation, we decided to take on the impetuous Englishman in maneuvering positions. He was a dangerous attacker who was well prepared in many sharp lines of play, and while this was also my strong suit, my coach and I felt I would have a considerable advantage in slower games. My analysis had revealed how uncomfortable Short was playing without activity. In my preparation for the Short match, my team and I designed my opening repertoire to steer clear of the double-edged variations he preferred. To this end, I selected the slower developing lines of the venerable Ruy Lopez opening, well known for positional maneuvering. Named for a 16th century chess-playing Spanish priest, it has earned the nickname the Spanish Torture for its grinding effectiveness. I started out with 3 wins in the first 4 games to take a commanding lead in the match, scheduled for 24 games. I had won both of my games with White using this slow maneuvering style, and many wondered if I would switch to more aggressive variations to try to knock out my opponent while he was against the ropes. Short was reeling. Maybe this would be a good time to switch gears to keep him off guard. I did make a change, but not of strategy. I used my lead to probe his defenses, looking for weaknesses. I soon scored 2 more wins by sticking to my strategy of opening quietly with the white pieces. Trusting yourself means having faith in your strategy and in your instincts. When I was playing my best chess, I showed up for each contest believing the game was mine to win. I arrived at the airport with the feeling the tournament was going to have to be taken from me. In my new life in politics, I continued to set ambitious goals. My chess opponents knew I was coming to the board to fight hard from start to finish, and I want my political opponents to know the same thing. The moment that confidence weakens, indecisiveness and concrete failures usually follow. If we aren't confident, we begin to postpone decisions, and this leads to a destructive cycle of anxiety and time pressure. Confidence and the time factor. The worst enemy of the strategist is the clock. Time trouble, as we call it in chess, reduces us all to pure reflex and reaction, tactical play. Emotion and instinct cloud our strategic vision when there is no time for proper evaluation. A game of chess can suddenly seem a lot like a game of chance. Even the finest sense of intuition can't flourish in the long term without accurate calculations. It was March 4th, 2004, and my clock was ticking down in a critical game at the most important tournament of the year, the Linares tournament in Spain. I was in second place. If I won this game, I would move into a tie for first. There were 10 minutes left on my clock, and a storm was brewing on the board. I had a double-edged position against Bulgarian star Topalov, the 2005 FIDE world champion. I amassed a giant army against his king, and confident of my overwhelming power on that side of the board, launched an attack. I saw a promising continuation, but I couldn't find anything concrete in my calculations. There were too many possibilities for both sides. 8 minutes. It looked good. My intuition said it must be good. I went for it. Now it was Topalov's turn to sweat, but he proved up to the task. He defended well, setting me new problems that I had to solve in my limited time. We both played quickly, on instinct, with our hands as much as our brains. 4 minutes. Wait, was his last move a mistake? True to his combative nature, Topalov had lashed out instead of defending. To keep my attack going, I sacrificed a piece, creating a serious material disadvantage. If my attack failed, I would lose the game, so there was no way back. My heart leapt, and adrenaline flooded my system. I sensed the decisive blow was close at hand. With a leap of my knight, I could uncover an attack by my rook against his king. It looked devastating. Where to move the knight? The e4 square or the e6 square? Forward or backward? 2 minutes. My brain was crunching through the alternatives at top speed, trying to find the best moves for both sides through the mind-bending variations. I visualized how I would counter his possible defenses. If here, then there. If this, then that. 4 moves ahead, 5 moves, 6 moves. There was no time to analyze deeply enough to be sure of everything. 1 minute. Wait, it looked as if the backward move was a losing option. Unnerved, I pushed my knight to the forward square, already sensing the opportunity was gone. Topalov reacted quickly, his king running for cover. With seconds left, I could only force his king back and forth. There was no way to administer a coup de grace. The game ended in a draw by repetition. No win, no loss. I felt deflated in my chair. Had I missed a win? After such a thrilling hunt, my quarry had eluded me. I finished the tournament in a bitter tie for second place, and I was racked with concern about how my intuition had betrayed me at a critical moment. As it turned out, I had moved my knight to the wrong square. Analysis later showed that moving it backward to e4, the wrong direction, away from the enemy king, would have given me an overpowering attack. I had looked at that move during my calculations, but had seen that his queen could check my king, coming back to defend. When the game ended, Topalov suggested the alternative knight leap to e4 is winning, and I replied, yes, but what about the queen check on c1? He looked puzzled, and just from the look on his face, I suddenly realized that this move would have been illegal. The queen could not reach c1 at all. A total hallucination. Ironically, or perhaps just cruelly, the winning move would have removed a key defensive piece, just the sort of strategic objective I would naturally have pursued had I had enough time to back it up with calculation. The most disturbing thing about this miss was that one of the strongest parts of my game had always been fast and deep calculation, tactics. I was always confident of my ability to analyze complications better than my opponents. When it came time for me to deliver the killer blow, My adversary rarely escaped. I left Linares with my self-confidence shaken. Of course, nobody scores 100% on every exam, but this was still troubling. At 40, I was considerably older than most of my competitors, who were usually in their 20s and occasionally in their teens. If age was creeping up on me and my tactics were getting shaky, how much longer could I stay on top? I would have to take a close look at my game, especially my tactical abilities, before I got back on the stage. In hindsight, I realized that the real mistake I'd made was letting myself get into such a time crunch in the first place. As later games would show, my faculties were still in fine working order. I hadn't been playing often, and my rustiness had led to a lack of decisiveness, a lack of faith in my own calculations. I had spent precious minutes double-checking things that I should have played quickly. My intuition and my tactics fell out of sync. The lesson? The best plans and the most devious tactics can still fail without confidence. Never give in. Never, never, never. Winston Churchill's books are among my favorites. His tenacity, some call it stubbornness, pervaded every aspect of his character. His proposal of a military campaign in the Dardanelles during World War I, the very one that led to the resignation of Admiral Fisher, culminated in one of the worst military disasters in British history. And yet, 25 years later, he had the insight to realize that his essential idea had been correct, and he had the courage again to implement the plan. In 1915, Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, convinced the cabinet and Britain's allies to attack Gallipoli at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, to create a supply line to Russia, and to force the Germans to open a new front. Ships and troops were diverted from the Mediterranean, this is what angered Fisher, and sent to the Dardanelles, a strategic strait that divides the Asian and European parts of Turkey. Initial naval attacks went well, but that was the end of the good news for the British. When troops were brought in, they were put under the command of Sir Ian Hamilton, who knew little of the situation on the ground. He was paired with two other commanders, with no one in overall charge of the operation. One tactical blunder followed another, as the British troops suffered heavy casualties against the inspired defense of the Turks, whose eventual victory led to the rise of Colonel Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, who after World War I would go on to found the Turkish Republic. The British finally retreated after losing 200,000 men and 3 battleships. This humiliating disaster cost Churchill his job at the Admiralty, although he was called back right after the start of the next World War. In 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Churchill realized that the Allies were facing a problem similar to that of 1915. The Soviets were low on supplies, much as Russia had been at the start of World War I. One of the first British-Soviet actions in July 1941 was to occupy Iran to ensure overland supply lines and communication with the Soviets, because they knew that the northern sea lanes would be unsafe and insufficient in a long war. In October, the Allies began to supply the Soviets, much in the way Churchill had imagined in 1915. In 1943, this proved to be vital to the USSR's war effort, with over 300,000 tons of food, ammunition, and other essential supplies coming in per month. Churchill had recognized that the failure of the Gallipoli campaign didn't mean the reasoning behind it was faulty. In his 1937 book, Great Contemporaries, Churchill, likely referring to a similar phrase of Samuel Johnson's, wrote that courage is the first of human qualities because it guarantees all others. To achieve success, our strategy must be implemented with accurate tactics. Our tactics should be guided by our overall strategic vision and goals. But both are only guaranteed by the confidence to trust the correctness of our strategy and the accuracy of our tactics. That psychological strength is the foundation. If that weakens, the entire structure falls apart. Chapter 4. Calculation. I see only one move ahead, but it is always the correct one. José Raúl Capablanca, 3rd World Chess Champion. Without a doubt, the question I am most often asked is, how many moves ahead do you see? As with most such questions, the honest answer is, it depends. But that hasn't stopped people from asking, or generations of chess players from concocting pithy replies. As far as needed is one, or one move further than my opponent. There is no concrete figure, no maximum or minimum. In a way, it's like asking a painter how many brush strokes he uses in a painting. Calculation in chess is not 1 plus 1. It's more like figuring out a route on a map that keeps changing before your eyes. The first reason it is impossible to reduce chess to arithmetic is because the possibilities are so numerous. For every move, there might be 4 or 5 viable responses. Then 4 responses to each of those moves, and so on. The branching of the decision tree grows geometrically. Just 5 moves into the game, there are millions of possible positions. The total number of positions in a game of chess is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. True, a majority of these are not realistic game positions, but the vast scope of what is possible in chess should manage to keep humans occupied for another few hundred years. Like a weatherman's forecasts, the further ahead you look, the more likely it is you will miscalculate. We can define calculation as a sequence in which the outcome of step C depends entirely on the accuracy of our conclusion about steps A and B. Each added step into the hypothetical future increases the chance of making a mistake. We often hear just about any type of mistake referred to as a miscalculation. It's more useful to think of this as a specific type of error, one in which the factors were known, but the conclusion reached was incorrect. In chess, both players know all the factors, but this is, of course, impossible in politics. It is still impressive how many political blunders derive from obvious assumptions. Through military might and clever diplomacy, Otto von Bismarck created a German empire in the second half of the 19th century. After unifying Germany, he managed to isolate France and cut off Russia, while he allied with Austria and Italy. He was sure that France and Russia would never join forces because an absolute monarch such as the Russian Tsar would never take off his hat and listen to the Marseillaise, the anthem that had accompanied the march of so many royals to the guillotine. In 1894, 4 years after Kaiser Wilhelm II had replaced Bismarck as chancellor, the French signed a military alliance with Russia. And when a fleet of French ships visited Russia, the Tsar not only listened to the Marseillaise, but indeed took off his hat. Bismarck had had all the information he needed, but he came to the wrong conclusion and underestimated the growing Russian economy's need for French credit. Most of all, he assumed royal pride would outweigh fiscal necessity. His miscalculation had repercussions that lasted into the First World War. Bismarck was a great tactician and strategist, but in this case, he failed to credit others with the same qualities. He committed the blunder of counting on his opponents to make a mistake he would never have made himself. Calculation must be focused and disciplined. You might imagine that a game limited to a board with 64 squares would easily be dominated by the calculating power of today's computer technology. But as it turns out, deep calculation isn't what distinguishes the champions. Studies performed by Dutch psychologist Adrian de Groot have shown that elite players don't in fact look ahead that much further than considerably weaker players while solving chess problems. They can on occasion, but it doesn't define their superior play. A computer may look at millions of moves per second, but lacks a deep sense of why one move is better than another. This capacity for evaluation is where computers falter and humans excel. It doesn't matter how far ahead you see if you don't understand what you are looking at. We have seen that precise calculation is the first key to effective decision-making. The second is the ability to evaluate both static, permanent, and fluid factors. When I contemplate my move, I don't start out by immediately running down the decision tree for every possible move. First, I consider all of the elements in the position, such as material and king safety, so I can establish a strategy and develop intermediate objectives. Only when I have these goals in mind do I select the moves to analyze. That analysis must be ordered to be effective. Anyone who has ever written down a list of errands understands that tasks can more effectively be done when prioritized and performed in optimal order. My experience guides me to select 2 or 3 candidate moves to focus on. Usually, one can be discarded relatively quickly as inferior, and often another comes into consideration to take its place. Then I begin to expand the tree one move at a time, looking at the likely responses and my answering moves. In a complicated game, this tree of analysis usually stays within a depth of 4 or 5 moves, that is, 4 or 5 moves for each player, or 8 to 10 total moves. We call these half moves. 1 move for white and 1 for black equals 1 full move. Unless there are special circumstances, a particularly dangerous position, or a key moment in the game, I know from years of experience that's a safe, practical amount of calculation. The decision tree must constantly be pruned. Move from one variation to the next, discarding the less promising moves and following up the better ones. Don't jump to another before you've reached a conclusion on the move you're analyzing. You'll waste precious time and risk confusing yourself. You must also have a sense of when to stop. Discipline yourself to keep calculating until you have determined a path that is clearly the best, or until further analysis won't return enough value for the time spent. Imagination, calculation, and my greatest game. In some cases, the best move will be so obvious that it's not necessary to work out all the details, especially if time is of the essence. This is rare, however, and it is often when we assume something is obvious and react hastily that we make a mistake. More often, you should break routine by doing more analysis, not less. These are the moments when your instincts tell you that something is lurking below the surface, or that you've reached a critical juncture and a deeper look is required. To detect these key moments, you must be sensitive to trends and patterns in your analysis. If one of the branches in your analysis starts to show surprising results, good or bad, it's worth investing the time to find out what's going on. Sometimes it's hard to explain exactly what makes those bells go off in your head telling you there is more to be found. The important thing is to listen to them when they ring. One of my best games came about thanks to this sixth sense. The scene was the strong traditional super tournament, roughly the equivalent of a Grand Slam tournament in tennis or a major in golf. In Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands, my co-actor was again the battling Bulgarian Topalov. Topalov also deserves marquee billing because it takes 2 to create a truly beautiful chess game. His stern resistance pushed me to the limits of my calculation abilities in this game, in which I played the deepest combination of my career. An entire booklet dedicated to this one game was later published in Greece, and I admit that 90% of its analysis didn't enter my mind during the game. Once I registered a few of the exciting possibilities to chase Black's king across the board, I focused and concentrated on his most likely attempts at defense. In my calculations, I realized that it would be like walking a tightrope. One slip would be fatal. I would sacrifice half my pieces to flush his king out into the open. If it didn't work, I would be completely lost. So I had no choice but to invest the extra time to be as sure as possible. I kept pushing deeper into my mental image of the position. Sure, there must be something. Until finally I saw the final winning position, an incredible 15 moves away. It was a feat of calculation, but there is no way your mind can go that far without help from your imagination. The combination would never have occurred to me had I taken a purely deductive approach to the position. It was not the product of logical analysis showing a mathematically perfect conclusion. As proof, I can only point out that at least at one point I missed the strongest move, found in later analysis by other grandmasters. As an aside, although it turned out well for me, my missing the best move illustrates one of the perils of becoming fixated on a distant goal. I was so entranced by my vision of the gold at the end of this rainbow that I stopped looking around as I approached it. I'd convinced myself that such a pretty finish must be scientifically correct too, a potentially dangerous delusion. The key to calculation is understanding its limits. You have to recognize when you are leaving the realm of what can be confirmed beyond a reasonable doubt. At that point, You have to fall back on more general considerations and your intuition. In any endeavor, it can be fatal to believe you are absolutely sure, when in fact the situation is too complex, or the outcome too far away, to be solved by calculation alone. Chapter 5. Talent. When I was 11, I just got good. Bobby Fischer, 11th World Chess Champion. What separates an elite chess player, one in the top 10 in the world, from the many strong players who never crack the top 20 or the top 100? Each player has his or her own reasons for success or failure, but the most debated among these is that most elusive quarry, talent. There are so many definitions and aspects of talent, it's little wonder we have trouble deciding who has it and who doesn't. Prodigies make this easy, but we can do little more than marvel at the likes of Mozart, who composed symphonies at age 5, and Pascal, who was creating original geometric theorems on the walls of his childhood home at 12. Chess, along with music and mathematics, is one of the few pursuits in which superior ability and originality can manifest at a young age. José Capablanca reputedly learned the game at the age of 4 just by watching his father play, and soon proved a match for accomplished players. Polish-born Samuel "Sammy" Reshevsky was trotted out in a sailor suit to give exhibitions at the age of 7, defeating entire roomfuls of adult players all across Europe. Reshevsky was poked and prodded by every type of psychologist in a search of the source of his miraculous abilities. How could mere children master a game that was synonymous with complexity and difficulty? We are all familiar with tales of such precocity, and are in general willing to accept that these individuals are born with special gifts. Still, even their extraordinary talents require the opportunity to develop. Had his father been a painter instead of a music teacher, would we know of Mozart today? My own development certainly owed a great deal to external factors. I grew up in Baku, Azerbaijan, then part of the loose Soviet Empire. It was a typical imperial outpost, a rich melting pot of ethnicities that was somewhat flattened by a common language and a dominant Russian-Soviet culture. My own roots were characteristic: an Armenian mother, Klara Kasparova, and a Jewish father, Kim Weinstein. What they call an explosive combination. The atmosphere in our household was a combination of my mother's rigid pragmatism mixed with my father's contrarian creativity. The rest of the clan included my father's brother, Leonid, and their cousin Marat, a famous lawyer in Baku. Their circle largely consisted of professors and intellectuals who constantly questioned the official view, not only the blatant propaganda of the Soviet government. For them, the conventional wisdom was to be doubted out of hand. Everything should be subjected to questioning. We would listen to Radio Liberty and Voice of America, and I remember getting into great debates with Grandpa Shagan, my mother's father, who did not take kindly to views critical of the state. He had spent his whole life building communism, and so the food shortages of the late 1970s were to be a source of great disillusionment for him. Between these poles, I grew up reading a lot of books and asking a lot of questions. When my father died, I went to live with my mother's family. When I began to have public success in chess, it seemed natural to take her family name. My teacher, Botvinnik, himself of Jewish ancestry, added that it wouldn't hurt my chances of success in the USSR not to be named Weinstein. My father was the first to recognize my natural aptitude for chess. He was struggling with leukemia when he made his last decision, which was to send me for chess schooling at the age of 7. My mother enthusiastically supported my development. Nowadays, she likes to remind me how her efforts were more often directed at controlling my willfulness than promoting it. She tells the story of a phone call she received from my second-grade teacher, who had chastised me for challenging her in class. The teacher told me I should not do this because it would make everyone think I believed I was the cleverest in the class. To which I replied, "But isn't that true? I do not envy my former teachers." Just about every young star in any field can give credit to a determined parent giving talent a push. As for internal factors, it is clear to me that I would not have achieved such success at anything other than chess. The game came to me naturally, its requirements fitting my talents like a glove. My talents for memorization and calculation were blended with an aggressive streak for an ideal chess combination. Recognizing the patterns in our lives. What we refer to as talent is actually a set of attributes, not just a single on-off switch. A concert pianist needs physical dexterity as well as a good ear and a sense of rhythm. Most things can be broken down into such skill sets. Think about what it takes to be a good manager, a good general, a good parent. Chess is no exception, and to excel at it requires a synthesis of developed talent and acquired knowledge. It may seem an unusual pairing, but as the most important innate qualities, I would cite memory and fantasy. These are the qualities the greatest players exhibited in abundance. People often talk about a good memory as if it were something you either possess or you don't, such as height or blue eyes. Many try to categorize it, saying they have a good memory for faces or a bad memory for names. We perpetuate stereotypes, like the absent-minded professor who has memorized the complete works of Chaucer but can't remember where he parked his car. We know that the brain stores long-term and short-term memories in different places. There are stories of people with total recall who are capable of effortlessly reciting entire phone books. People often believe that elite chess players must possess such faculties, but this is far from the truth. It's true that to be a great chess player, you must have a good memory, but it is much harder to explain what exactly we are remembering. Patterns, numbers, mental pictures of the board and pieces? The answer seems to be all of the above. The practice of blindfold chess has fascinated the world for centuries. In 1783, the great French player François-André Danican-Philidor played 2 games simultaneously without sight of the boards and was acclaimed a genius without parallel. One newspaper account described it as a phenomenon in the history of man, and so should be hoarded among the best samples of human memory, till memory shall be no more. Certainly it is impressive to see a man with his back to the boards, or more theatrically, literally blindfolded, calling out strong moves and overwhelming his opponents who are seated at the board. But it is no miracle. Nearly 200 years later, the Polish Grandmaster Miguel Najdorf was stranded in Argentina at the outbreak of World War II. When the war ended, Najdorf had the idea of trying to communicate word of his survival to his family in Poland by staging the largest exhibition of blindfold chess ever attempted, on 45 boards simultaneously. That's 1,440 pieces to keep track of. After nearly 24 hours of play, Najdorf scored 39 wins, 4 draws, and just 2 losses against his opponents, all of whom had full sight of the board. This is not to say that Najdorf had a perfect photographic memory. He did not. What he had was a remarkable chess memory, the ability to retain the patterns and movements of pieces on a 64-square board, which is as essential to a player when he can see the board as when he cannot. This capacity for recall and visualization makes our calculations quick and accurate, and means we don't have to rely on calculating every position from scratch. If you are familiar with a similar position, and can remember what worked or didn't work before, you have a big advantage over someone who is seeing it for the first time. The position doesn't have to be an exact replica to produce this benefit. If you play the Najdorf defense your entire career, you develop a feel for what moves to make and when in response to certain ideas and plans. We automatically find parallels and apply our knowledge of analogous positions. A grandmaster will retain tens of thousands of fragments and patterns of chess data and adds to them constantly through frequent practice. My ability to recall so many games and positions doesn't mean I have an easier time remembering names, dates, or anything else. De Groot illustrated this in an elegant fashion in his 1944 study of chess players. He tested players of every level, from former world champions to beginners, seeking to unlock the secrets of master chess. He gave the players a set of positions from games to memorize, then recorded how well they could reproduce them. Predictably, the stronger the player, the better he scored. The elite players scored 93%, the experts 72%, the average players just 51%. 30 years later, in 1973, researchers Bill Chase and Herb Simon replicated de Groot's experiment, but added a key second set of test positions. For the second set, they placed the pieces on the boards randomly, not following the rules of the game or any pattern at all. As in de Groot's study, the stronger players scored better on the positions taken from actual games. But with the random positions, all levels of players scored approximately the same. Without being able to utilize patterns, or what psychologists call chunks, the masters didn't display superior memory prowess. The same processes are at work in every human endeavor. Rote memorization is far less important than the ability to recognize meaningful patterns. When we tackle a problem, we never start from scratch. We instinctively, even unconsciously, look for a past parallel. We work out the authenticity of the parallels and see if we can work out a similar recipe from these slightly different ingredients. Traders see trends in the graphs of a stock. Parents observe patterns of behavior in their children. An experienced courtroom lawyer can intuit the most effective way to handle a witness. All derive from a combination of experience and consciously observed memory. And while practice alone can make you competent, to excel requires actively examining what you are retaining. How often do you review your performance at the end of the day? What did you see? What did you learn? Did you observe or experience something new that's worth taking note of? Would you recognize that situation, that opportunity, that pattern, should it occur again? Elite performers, such as Olympic athletes, must be this critical, this self-aware, to succeed. The benefits of such rigorous behavior aren't so obvious if you work in an office, but they are there just the same. Even people in leadership roles are too often content to just get through the day. Most people talk about unwinding after work or school, putting the day behind them so they can relax. How much more effective would they become if, at the end of each day, they asked themselves what lessons they had taken away for tomorrow? We can do a great deal to make our own luck when it comes to matching our abilities with our careers. The problem is that as we get older and more settled in our ways and our professions, we rarely test our resources. And without constant testing, it is impossible to discover what our gifts are. I believe it's essential to push the boundaries and constantly widen the angle of the lens we use to view the world. One crucial way to do that is through what I call creative experimentation. The power of fantasy. The French novelist Anatole France wrote that, "To accomplish great things, we must dream as well as act." In chess, we have a name for the sort of imagination required to break out of the usual patterns and startle our opponents. We call it fantasy. This is where we let our mind drift away from the calculation of variations to imagine hidden possibilities in the position. Occasionally, we can find a novel idea that all but breaks the rules, one that finds a way to use the unique confluence of factors on the board at that exact instant to brilliant advantage. Ironically, chess computers are good at producing moves that strike humans as full of tactical fantasy. Computers don't rely on patterns and hold no prejudices against moves that are ugly or appear illogical or absurd. They simply count the beans and play the best move they find. It's much harder for a human being, a creature of habit, to be so brutally objective. Fantasy can cut through fog. Keeping an open mind is difficult in a game where so much depends on patterns and logic. For inspiration, I look to those great players who consistently found original ways to shock their opponents. None did this better than the 8th world champion, Mikhail Tal. The magician of Riga rose to become champion in 1960 at age 23 and became famous for his aggressive, volatile play. He would sacrifice pawns and pieces in ways that went completely against the grain of the modern scientific era of the game, established by Botvinnik. Tal reinvented the romantic form of chess, the way it was played back in the mid-19th century, when defense was considered cowardly. How did he do it? How could it be that Tal's knights seemed more agile and his bishops faster than those of other grand masters? He was a tremendous calculator, But that was only a small part of his gift. He had the ability to realize when calculation alone wasn't going to solve the problem. Here's how he described a classic game in which he was contemplating a knight sacrifice. Ideas piled up one after another. I would transport a subtle reply to my opponent, which worked in one case, to another situation where it would naturally prove quite useless. As a result, my head became filled with a completely chaotic pile of all sorts of moves, and the famous tree of variations, from which the trainers recommend that you cut off the small branches, in this case, spread with unbelievable rapidity. And then suddenly, for some reason, I remembered the classic couplet by well-known Soviet children's poet Korny Chukovsky. Oh, what a difficult job it was to drag out of the marsh the hippopotamus. I don't know from what associations the hippopotamus got onto the chessboard, but although the spectators were convinced that I was continuing to study the position, I was trying at this time to work out just how would you drag a hippopotamus out of the marsh. I remember how jacks figured in my thoughts, as well as levers, helicopters, even a rope ladder. After a lengthy consideration, I admitted defeat as an engineer and thought spitefully, well, let it drown. And suddenly, the hippopotamus disappeared, went off from the chessboard just as he had come on, of his own accord. And straight away, the position did not appear to be so complicated. Now I somehow realized that it was not possible to calculate all the variations, and that the knight sacrifice was, by its very nature, purely intuitive. And since it promised an interesting game, I could not refrain from making it. And the following day, it was with pleasure that I read in the paper how Mikhail Tal, after carefully thinking over the position for 40 minutes, made an accurately calculated piece sacrifice. It's a charming example of Tal's wit, and more important, an insight into his problem-solving method. He realized that he was wrong to attempt to fix with a wrench something that required a hammer. Even his imaginative mind occasionally required a push to shift into a different gear. And most important, he allowed himself to follow this line of fantastical thinking in the heat of battle. Developing the habit of imagination. Fantasy isn't something you can turn on with the flip of a switch. The key is to indulge it as often as you can to encourage the habit, to allow your unconventional side to flourish. Everyone develops his own device for prompting his muse. The goal is for it to become continuous and unconscious, so your fantasy is always active. It's not about being an inventor with an occasional flash of creativity, but about being innovative in your decision-making all the time. While the name Joseph Wilson might not ring a bell, the company he led, Xerox, certainly will. Wilson was himself an inventor, but the creative attitude he brought to the company, originally named Haloid Company, was more important than anything Wilson created in a laboratory. He used to tell new employees, "We do not want to do things in the same old way. Therefore, as you come here, I hope that you come with an attitude that change will be a way of life for you. You will not do things tomorrow the way you are doing them today." He later established the famed Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, which pioneered the earliest versions of the personal computer, the mouse, and the graphical user interface. From my old chess training routines to my sleeping patterns, I confess to being a creature of habit. So it requires considerable effort for me to take Wilson's advice. At the board, I always try to let my mind wander, to occasionally ignore the fog of variations and take a mental stab in the dark. In a competitive situation, such moves, today we might call them thinking outside the box, have the added benefit of often coming as a complete surprise to your opponent. The time he has spent thinking on your move has mostly been wasted, and the landscape of the game has changed. It's more than playing a good move, an objectively strong move. Moves with an extra charge of fantasy can startle your competition into making mistakes. Here's an example. In 1997, I was playing in a tournament in Tilburg, the Netherlands, and in the 5th round, I had the black pieces against one of the world's leading fantasy players, the Latvian-born Alexei Shirov, who now plays for Spain. The creative Shirov was trained in his early years by Mikhail Tal himself, a pedigree without peer when it comes to exotic attacking play. This time, however, I gave him a taste of his own medicine. In a complicated position, with chances for both sides, Shirov moved his rook up the board, preparing to attack my queen on the next move. I obviously had to get my queen out of the way, and I sat looking at the few possible retreats. All the options would leave the position dynamically balanced, but I was disappointed there wasn't the opportunity for more. Before I resigned myself to the seemingly inevitable queen move, I took a deep breath and surveyed the rest of the board. As with so many fantasy moves, this one started with a mental, wouldn't it be nice if you daydream a little about what you'd like to see happen, sometimes you find that it is really possible. What if I ignored his threat to my queen? He would have extra material, but my pieces, while technically outgunned by his queen, would be active, and he'd be under pressure. So instead of picking up my queen, my hand lifted my king and moved it a single square toward the center of the board. The paradox was satisfying, ignoring all the action and threats, to play an innocuous-looking move with the weakest piece on the board. Of course, I was also sure that it was a strong move on its own merits. Fantasy must be backed up by sober evaluation and calculation, or you spend your life making beautiful blunders. Shirov didn't adapt well to the new situation. A born attacker, he was suddenly on the defensive. The position was objectively about even, but he quickly made a serious mistake, and it didn't take long to wrap up the game after that. I had the pleasure of sacrificing even more material at the very end to finish things off with a flourish. Too often, we quickly discard apparently outlandish ideas and solutions, especially in areas where the known methods have been in place for a long time. The failure to think creatively is as much self-imposed as it is imposed by the parameters of our jobs and of our lives. What if often leads to why not? And at that point, we must summon our courage and find out. Be aware of your routines, then break them. There are as many ways to engage your fantasy as there are decisions to be made during a day. You won't find new ways of solving problems unless you look for new ways and have the nerve to try them when you do find them. They won't all work as expected, of course. The more you experiment, the more successful your experiments will be. Break your routines, even to the point of changing ones you are happy with, to see if you can find new and better methods. In the competitive chess world, I had clear standards for success and failure. That meant it was relatively easy to determine what worked and what did not. Trial and error led me to establish and refine my successful routines. When I had a poor result, I knew it was time to re-examine these things, both in my chess and in my day-to-day life. Without obvious benchmarks for success and failure, it is even more important to have a constant process of re-evaluation. Chapter 6. Preparation. If a man has a talent and cannot use it, he has failed. Thomas Wolfe. Like the proverbial tree falling in the forest with no one around to hear, talent undiscovered may as well not exist. That being the case, we can hardly lament its loss. We can, however, mourn the talent that goes undeveloped, talent that exists but is squandered. In contrast, we often reserve the highest praise for those who overachieved with limited natural abilities, those who outworked and outperformed rivals who possessed greater innate gifts. That last tendency has always struck me as unfair. Why isn't the capacity for hard work considered a natural gift? I don't think it's a compliment to say that someone did more with less, even though it's usually intended that way. If a soccer player who is short and can't run fast practices more than everyone else and becomes the superior player, has he overcome a talent deficit or simply exploited his talent to work harder and found a way to be successful through determination and focus? Michael Jordan was famous for his athleticism and high-flying dunks, Yet he was also the first to arrive at practice and the last to leave. In interviews, Jordan's teammates and coaches all talk about his extreme discipline, not his leaping ability. One veteran NBA manager said of Jordan's talent, "Without the ceaseless work ethic, Jordan is merely another talented athlete gliding through an admirable career, but nothing historic." I agree. But again, this makes it sound as if Jordan's discipline and capacity for work are not intrinsic parts of his talent. The ability to push yourself to the limit day after day, and to do so effectively, may not be as evident as physical skills, but it was something Michael Jordan cultivated his entire career, and is a talent that we should all try to cultivate. Results are what matter. Throughout my chess-playing life, people complimented me, sometimes in a backhanded way, on the depth and breadth of my preparation. In this way, I was part of a proud lineage. In the 1920s, Alekhine worked harder than anyone before him, changing the culture of a gentleman's game. For his efforts, he was often branded obsessed by those he defeated. In the 1940s, Botvinnik's rigorous mind and habits transformed the game into a full-time profession. In the 1970s, Fischer's fantastic dedication forced every other player to spend more time studying or be left behind. My work ethic developed from the disciplined environment created by my mother and my teacher, Botvinnik. I had a ceaseless appetite for opening preparation, which combines research, creativity, and memorization. I studied all the latest games from the leading players and carefully noted their innovations. Then I would analyze them and try to improve on them. To me, the opening systems were an avenue for creativity, not simply a matter of imitation. My training sessions with coaches as a youngster helped form my sense of discipline. Goals were set, and certain hours on my schedule were allocated for work on the openings, for example. It was clear to me at a young age that such work paid concrete dividends, and that without it, I would be squandering my abilities. Botvinnik had no patience for brilliant ideas that weren't backed up with exhaustive analysis. I learned to enjoy the study and analysis process itself, and not just to see it as a necessary evil or means to an end. Over time, I came to relish my preparation time because it gave me the feeling that while my competitors were sleeping, I was improving. Not long after my explosive entry into the international chess world, I started to hear whispers that credited much of my success to deep study with a Soviet team. In the years that followed, this developed into a full-scale myth. Kasparov has a team of grandmasters churning out opening novelties day and night. He has a supercomputer. After a while, it started to grate to hear these things repeated to me in interviews, although I tried to take them as compliments. As with most urban legends, however, these stories have a grain of truth. It has long been common for top players to work with analytical assistants, called seconds, as in the days of duels, especially during World Championship matches. When I had the resources to do so, I began to work with a trainer full-time, and not only right before and during big events. As for my computer, I was the first player to incorporate machine analysis into my preparation and to systematize the use of playing programs and databases. And while it was the best my techie cousin could put together, the PC I used was never beyond the reach of anyone with a good computer store nearby. Instead of listening to what people said about how I achieved them, I focused on the results. The concrete methods I used, a fixed number of hours per week for specific training tasks, for example, wouldn't work for everyone, but they worked well for me. If critics and competitors can't match your results, they will often denigrate the way you achieve them. Fast, intuitive types are called lazy. Dedicated burners of midnight oil are called obsessed. And while it's obviously not a bad idea to hear and consider the opinions of others, you should be suspicious when these criticisms emerge right on the heels of a success. Inspiration versus perspiration. Everyone at any age has talents that aren't fully developed, even those who reach the top of their profession. The Cuban Capablanca was, for example, considered an invincible chess machine. There's some truth to this. He once went 8 years without a defeat, but Capablanca, if not perhaps as lazy as the legend, and his own claims, would have it, detested study. A bon vivant whose expenses were covered by a sinecure with the Cuban diplomatic office, he rarely prepared for his opponents and liked to brag that he had never seriously studied. He was confident he could escape from any trap he fell into, and he was usually right. When Capablanca took the crown from Lasker in 1921, it was considered an overdue coronation for a reign that could last decades. Capa made chess look easy, and for him it was. But he relied too much on his native ability, and his grip on the title lasted only 6 years. Fittingly, his conqueror, the Russian Alexander Alekhine, was one of the most fantastically dedicated players the game has ever seen. In an age when the gentleman chess player was still common, and chess as a profession was considered questionable, Alekhine made chess his life as no one had before. There's an old story about a patron who invites Capablanca and Alekhine to the theater, and comments afterward, Capablanca never took his eyes off the chorus. Alekhine never looked up from his pocket chess set. Of course, Alekhine had his own fiery genius at the board, and by combining that with his intense dedication, he was more than a match for the raw talent of Capablanca. He had made a careful study of all of Capablanca's games, and though he found few specific weaknesses to exploit, he did find occasional errors that gave the lie to the myth of Capablanca's invincibility. Even so, Alekhine considered Capablanca the favorite going into their 1927 match in Buenos Aires. He had never before defeated the mighty Cuban, and had finished a distant second behind Capablanca at the New York tournament earlier that year. And yet, that easy victory was part of Capablanca's undoing. Capablanca lost the first game in Buenos Aires, and although he came back to briefly take the lead, he must have been surprised to find himself in such a bitter fight. The match became a test of wills, and here Alekhine, who once said, "What I do is not play, but struggle," was in his element. The drive that led him to prepare 8 hours a day, on principle, would not let him lose. Capablanca was unused to such strenuous effort, and finally went down to defeat after 34 games, a record that would stand until my 1984-85 match with Karpov lasted 48 games. As Alekhine later wrote of their match, "I did not believe I was superior to him. Perhaps the chief reason for his defeat was the overestimation of his own powers, arising out of his overwhelming victory in New York 1927, and his underestimation of mine." As a cautionary epilogue, we should also keep in mind that Alekhine himself could let down his guard. Alekhine's overindulgence of alcohol damaged his health and his career. Many credit his shocking and brief loss of the title to Max Euwe in 1935 to this as much as to his Dutch challenger's strong play and deep preparation. No longer underestimating his opponent, and on a strict regimen of milk, Alekhine reclaimed the title 2 years later.